Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're digging into a pretty bold 10-point plan aimed at completely overhauling India's high-stakes civil service exams. The big idea here? To make the whole process a lot fairer and way more transparent. And, it all kicks off with one single landmark Supreme Court decision.
Okay, so here's the game plan. We're going to start with that court ruling that really set this whole thing in motion. Then we'll get into what's being called the administrative battle that it sparked. From there, we'll walk through all the proposed reforms for the rules, for the tests themselves, and for the interviews. And finally, we'll look at the ultimate goal behind all of this, forging a new path to meritocracy. All right, so you might be asking, where did this whole reform agenda even come from? Well, it's all built on the foundation of a single, really important Supreme Court judgment. A judgment that, honestly, fundamentally changed the rules of the game. Now, what the court said here wasn't exactly a new rule. But what it did was powerfully and very clearly restate a core principle. And that is, the general category is not a reservation for upper castes. Think of it as an open merit pool. What that means is anyone from any background can earn a spot there based purely on their score.
Okay, so what does that actually mean in practice? Well, it's not about taking seats away from anyone. It's more like a cascade effect. Get this, when a high-scoring candidate from a reserved category gets a score so good that they qualify for that open merit pool, they don't use up a reserved spot. That actually frees up that reserved seat for another candidate from their own community. So it actually expands opportunity.
But, a victory in court is one thing. As the author of this agenda points out, that's really just the first step. The real challenge, the next big hurdle, is getting the system on the ground to actually follow through and implement what the court ordered.
And this right here, this gets to the absolute heart of the problem. You see, there's this huge disconnect between what the court ruled and what's actually happening day to day. The law states the principle loud and clear, but the administrative machinery, the bureaucracy running the exams, that's where the principle can get totally lost in translation.
The way the source material puts it is with this really powerful metaphor. It says, the Supreme Court gave everyone the key with its ruling, but the door is still shut. And it's locked by what the author calls administrative bias. So, these reforms we're about to discuss, think of them as the tools needed to finally pick that lock.
Okay, so how do you actually fix this? Well, the first batch of reforms really targets the basic rules of the game. The goal is simple: create a truly level playing field for every single person right from the very start.
The very first proposal is super simple, but it's also sweeping. It's a universal upper age limit of 35, and that would apply to every single candidate, no exceptions, regardless of their background or category. So the rationale here is twofold. First, it gets rid of the whole idea of special age extensions and any stigma that might come with them. And second, by making the limit high and universal, it acknowledges a simple reality. Candidates from rural or disadvantaged backgrounds often face a ton of hurdles that just mean they start their prep later in life.
All right, next up, following that same logic of one rule for everyone, the proposal standardizes the number of attempts. So what's the magic number? 6. 6 tries for every single applicant right across the board.
And this one is really about both fairness and perception. Giving everyone the same number of chances creates an equal safety net for what is, let's be honest, a notoriously difficult exam. It also helps to get rid of that perpetual aspirant label that can sometimes unfairly stick to certain candidates.
Okay, moving on from the basic rules. The agenda also proposes some pretty major reforms to the tests themselves, and the focus here is all about making sure that merit is measured as objectively as possible at every single stage of the process.
So a really key argument here is that reservation shouldn't just be a thing that's applied at the very end. It should be factored in at every stage. So, for example, if a reserved candidate scores high enough in the preliminary exam, the prelims, to qualify on open merit, well, they should move on to the next stage, the mains, in that general pool. And if you do that, it actually expands the total number of people who get to advance, which means more opportunity for everyone.
Now, this next proposal would dramatically reshuffle how the final score is calculated. The main written exam, the mains, would still be the biggest piece of the pie at 60%. But look at this. The interview's influence gets cut way down to just 20%. And in a really major shift, the preliminary exam, for the first time, would actually count for 20% of the final score. The idea is to reward consistent performance right from the very beginning.
The agenda also calls for a fundamental shift in the kind of questions that are asked. The goal is to move away from pure rote memorization, which, let's face it, really favors people who can afford those expensive coaching centers in big cities. Instead, the focus would be on questions that test analytical, self-taught skills. You combine that with offering the exams in more local languages, and you could really start to level the playing field for candidates no matter where they live.
All right, the final set of reforms we're going to look at zeroes in on what the source identifies as the one stage that is most vulnerable to subjective bias, and that is, of course, the personal interview. So, to combat potential bias, this proposal would get rid of arbitrary scores and replace them with a rigid slab system. Basically, interviewers couldn't just pluck a number out of the air. They would have to place a candidate into a specific grade, say A, B, C, or D, and each grade would have a fixed point value. This is a huge deal because it ensures that a stellar performance on the written exam can't be completely tanked by a low subjective interview score. And to take objectivity even one step further, a double-blind protocol is on the table. Just imagine this. You walk into your interview, and the panel knows absolutely nothing about you, except for a random code number. Your name, your caste, your religion, even what state you're from, all of it is concealed. On top of that, a uniform dress code would be required, which would remove any visual clues about your socioeconomic background. And the final piece of this interview puzzle is something called double randomization. So no more scheduling different categories of candidates on different days, which can be a huge giveaway. Instead, both the date of your interview and the specific panel you'll face would be assigned totally randomly, right on the spot. This makes it pretty much impossible for any board to have a clue about the background of the candidate who's about to walk through their door.
Okay, so after all these proposed changes to the rules, the tests, the interviews, what's the end game? What is all of this really building towards?
Well, the vision here is pretty clear. It's about building a system driven purely by what you can do, by your demonstrated ability. It's about creating a meritocracy where, as the quote says, your PIN code and your pedigree do not determine your rank.
And that really leaves us with a final pretty provocative question to think about. This 10-point agenda presents one very detailed vision for a fairer system, but it also forces all of us to consider the much bigger picture. In a country as vast and diverse as India, what does a true meritocracy really look like, and what will it take for us to actually build it?